Alright, so here we're going to be talking about eugenics, the ideal behind it, some brief history, and some possible ethical questions that could be raised with this kind of thinking. So we're going to start in England, actually. This is shortly after Charles Darwin released his work on the origin of the species. Sir Francis Galton in 1883, that was actually Charles Darwin's cousin. He was a British scholar, and piggybacking off of Charles Darwin's idea that only the strongest survived in nature, natural selection, Sir Francis Galton thought, well, why can't that be applied to society? And he performed studies and came to the conclusion that there were well-born individuals. That's what eugenics means, is well-born. And he found that there were certain desired traits in society. And he found that these desired traits had a higher concentration in people of elite positions. And he proposed a means of selective breeding to better the entire race overall, to pass these desirable traits on. So we have, if you look at the main idea, the overarching idea here is eugenics. We want to make the entire human race better. Now, already we have some ethical questions, and just some logical questions, honestly. First of all, you have a totally subjective view of what's better. So, what could be considered desirable is bound to change over time, and Darwin said that it does change over time. His research showed that the entire driving force behind evolution and natural selection was that the environment changed. So there you have your first issue and discordance with eugenics. Okay, so in America, sorry about that there. So in America, we have this ideology rising as well. However, the Americans decided to take a little bit of a different approach, rather than passively just selective breeding, which some could argue happens naturally anyway. You always want to be with somebody that you find attractive or you think is going to be a good provider, a good hunter. I mean, these are natural things. The Americans take it one step further, and they actually decide to stop undesirable traits altogether, rather than prevent them from being passed on in the first. Rather than focus on the desirable traits, they decide to focus on the undesirable. And these people, not only were there private beneficiaries that funded this kind of research, like Carnegie and Rockefeller, big names at the time, but this got so big that there was even public funding for this. The government was paying for this quote-unquote research. And this led to an actual government office founded called the Eugenics Record Office in New York. And this is actually an organization that actually recorded family histories. And kept track of people coming into the country, different kinds of health problems, names, personality traits, all sorts of things that could be considered undesirable. And what this research found was that there was a higher concentration of people with undesirable traits coming from immigrant families, people that were in poverty, just mostly minorities in general. And their solution to this was to restrict who could get married and have children, keep these people physically separated, and we even moved on to later forced sterilization in this country. So we're moving on to sterility now. And I have a picture of Margaret Sanger here, just because I want to clarify something. There's a lot of talk. Margaret Sanger was the founder of Planned Parenthood. And there's a lot of talk that Planned Parenthood was originally founded as a eugenics movement. And unfortunately, from all of the research and all of the people I've talked to about this does seem to be true. It sounds bad now, but, and it is not great, but you need to realize that this was a very popular opinion at the time, and this is a very important service today that obviously doesn't reflect those beliefs of the original founder, so you can't discourage Planned Parenthood by saying it is purely a eugenics movement. That being said, Margaret Sanger very much believed that through, in this case, birth control, they weren't quite keen on abortions yet, but through birth control given to uneducated or impoverished families, you could prevent them from having as many children. Not only could you help their situation, sorry about that, not only could you prevent their situation, but you could also prevent others like that from overtaking the population, which was a very prevalent fear back then, and some could argue it's still prevalent today. So what do we have here? Before sterility, we had stricter immigration, but eventually they decided to take all of the people who had these undesirable traits, and this could include a wide variety of things, things that we know now that don't likely have any sort of genetic background at all, like alcoholism or poverty. I thought this one was particularly interesting. Promiscuity. If you're going to be too friendly with people, we're going to... Yeah. So, but going back to Margaret Sanger, you notice that they say race here. It is argued, and it probably could be correct for a lot of people, that eugenics was a very racist movement. And it was. You're basically claiming other races besides the one you're trying to create are inferior. And there's a lot of accusations about Margaret Sanger where she did not only want to eliminate uneducated and poor people, but she wanted to eliminate immigrants, and particularly African Americans, from the population. And if we look at... I was reading a Time article on this. She stated very publicly that she... the most urgent problem of their time, and I quote her, is to limit and discourage the overfertility of the mentally and physically defective. She never said anything about black people. The main issue, and the thing that a lot of people, even Martin Luther King, actually, I think this is funny, he actually kind of praised her for his work for humanitarian efforts. Of course, I don't know if these letters came out yet. They found a private letter from Margaret Sanger in which she expressed her fears that people were going to say that she wanted to eliminate the African American race. Ironically, that letter is what sort of condemned her and recognized those fears. So, to clear things up, Margaret Sanger, was she a racist? In the respect that most eugenicists are probably racist. But there is no evidence that she was explicitly trying to eradicate the African American race. And Planned Parenthood today should not be blamed for the actions of its founder. Moving on. Right, wrong, or indifferent, public programs came around to sterilize these unfit individuals. it got to the point where 33 states, California being the most prominent, which I'll again find ironic with its, considering how liberal it is nowadays. California actually had a third of the nation's sterilizations, in which over 65,000 Americans were eventually sterilized. And being that it was run by the government, if you were sentenced to this to be sterilized forcefully, there was little you could do to escape. You had people in mental institutions being sterilized against their will. You had people in prisons being sterilized. It was everywhere. And this violates a huge thing of ethics. First of all, we have autonomy, where you're not letting people make their own decisions about their health. And then the most obvious one here is justice. You could even argue that we violate even more the do no harm. The list goes on. But these people honestly believe that this was all justified in the effort to make their perfect race, and they thought they were doing the entire world a favor. What the Americans didn't realize is there were people watching this going on, and they took it to heart. Back in Europe, we have the Socialist Party in Germany rising, and Hitler used this as part of his propaganda against his the people he tried to alienate. We see the stress of the Aryan race. Everybody knows their blonde hair, blue eyes. In addition to the mass executions, as we know, happened during the Holocaust, we also had these people in the concentration camps, and just people in general, just minority citizens, being sterilized so they couldn't pass down their inferior genes. Thankfully, once America became involved in World War II and realized what was going on in Germany, eugenics started to decline. People decided that maybe this isn't the best thing in the world. We should let people have the freedom to make their own choices about their bodies and their health and certain inalienable human rights. And then this whole situation kind of goes down a little bit. You still have people, certain people, thinking that a lot of nationalists, a lot of egocentrists thinking that their race could be better, or maybe people wishing that they had certain traits or wishing they didn't have certain traits. So we don't really have another big influx in the eugenics movement until the introduction of CRISPR-Cas9. And this was a gene editing tool that was isolated from certain bacteria. And initially it was used to repair DNA, it was to excise virulent DNA that had infected bacteria and repair the bacteria's own DNA. And eventually it was discovered that we could isolate CRISPR from the bacteria and use it in mammalian cells. And you can see here, we have the target gene, and we have the gene that the individual can actually say they want. So we can put certain desired traits into the genome of any mammal. And at first this was seen as a miracle. It could eliminate genetic disorders. You could use it to repair infants before they were even born. But then we get into the question of maybe my child won't be born with a debilitating illness or critical genetic defect, But what if I know he's going to not be tall because my wife and I are both short? Or what if I know that he's going to have acne because we both had acne? Or what if we know he's going to have curly hair instead of straight hair? He's going to lose his hair because there's a genetic background of that. Then you have the argument for designer babies. And we see people being concerned that this new technology will allow people to completely make their own person based on what they deem the best traits. You can insert any trait you want. You can replace a gene for brown eyes to have blue eyes, and then you, in theory... Okay, so we can then replace any inferior gene with the one that is deemed desirable, and that's it. And it's a highly effective mode of therapy. We see here, and the thing about CRISPR-Cas9, it is very precise in its splicing mechanisms. You can pinpoint the specific gene out of the genome and replace only that with little to no effect on the entire rest of the cell. And once you get that mutation in there, it replicates on its own. So then we have the argument for designer babies. We have the argument of playing God. And there are many people who advocate for the complete banning of any sort of genetic testing and modification before birth or even after. And there are a few biological reasons behind this as well. Going back to even Darwin, certain traits are beneficial in certain environments. If you make everybody the same based on what's favorable now and then the environment changes, we have the potential to lose our entire race because there was no diversity. We have potentially the risk of creating more genetic disasters in the future through later generations from using when people with too similar DNA try to reproduce. And then you have the more sentimental views of, are we playing God? One of the arguments I particularly like is, what are you saying to people with these traits that you're trying to either remove or replace from the genome? Or are you just going to claim that everybody with Down syndrome is less than human? Because if you had the choice, you would eliminate that disorder. Everybody with cystic fibrosis is less than a human. Do they get less than human rights? The list goes on. And that violates, again, justice. It could, in a very loose way, reflect autonomy because the embryo does not have a choice. And depending on state regulations, you could even go the other way. You could say that it affects autonomy because these things are banned. You could not save a child who would have a certain illness like cystic fibrosis or Down syndrome, or Turner syndrome, or anything that could actually result in early fatality or even stillborn child. And ultimately, these are the things we need to look at. We need to look at cost versus benefit. There's no easy answer on whether genetic modification should be, because you can't, when you say it's okay to use it for one thing, you set a precedent. And if that precedent is that it's okay to change for one thing, you weaken the line to go to other things.